The first time he called, I let it ring. The second time, I turned the phone face down on my kitchen table. By the seventh call, I was standing at the sink with both hands gripping the edge, staring at the dark window above it, like I might find an answer in my own reflection. By the 17th call, I finally listened to one voicemail. His voice was shaking. Not angry. Not proud. Not like the man who had signed the divorce papers with his new life already waiting outside the courthouse. He sounded frightened. "Elaine," he said, breathing hard. "Please, just call me back. Something happened at the wedding. You need to hear this from me." I stood there in my little rented kitchen in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with the refrigerator humming behind me and a cup of tea going cold beside the sink. His wedding. His mistress. His perfect new beginning. And now, after marrying the woman he had chosen over me, Richard Caldwell would not stop calling. That was when I realized something had gone terribly wrong. Not for me. For him. And I wish I could say I felt sorry right away. But after 34 years of marriage, betrayal teaches your heart to move slowly. 6 months earlier, I had still been Mrs. Elaine Caldwell, wife of Richard Caldwell, owner of a brick house in Des Moines, keeper of every holiday tradition, every birthday reminder, every doctor's appointment, every apology he never made. I was 61 years old when my marriage ended. Not with shouting. Not with a dramatic confession. With a text message that appeared on my husband's phone while he was taking a shower. I wasn't snooping. That matters to me even now. I had picked up his phone because our daughter Melissa had called twice, and Richard's phone was closer than mine. The message lit up the screen. "I miss your hands." That was all. 5 words. Enough to turn 34 years of marriage into something I suddenly did not recognize. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed with that phone in my hand, hearing the shower run behind the bathroom door. The sound felt normal. Too normal. That was the cruel part. The world did not stop just because mine had. When Richard came out, towel around his shoulders, he saw my face before he saw the phone. For 1 second, he looked confused. Then he looked tired. Not guilty. Tired. As if my finding out was an inconvenience he had been expecting. "Who is she?" I asked. He rubbed his face. "Elaine." That was how I knew. When a man says your name instead of answering the question, the answer is already standing in the room. Her name was Vanessa. She was 44. She worked at the real estate office where Richard had started spending more and more evenings supposedly helping with late closings. I asked how long. He said it didn't matter. I said it mattered to me. Finally, he admitted it had been almost 2 years. 2 years. That meant she had been in his life during our grandson's surgery. During my sister's funeral. During the Christmas, I baked his mother's pecan pie because he said it made him feel close to her. 2 years of me folding his shirts while another woman sent him messages about missing his hands. I didn't throw anything. I didn't scream. I think some women do, and I don't judge them for it. But I went very still. A quiet woman is not always a weak woman. Sometimes she is simply trying not to become someone she won't respect tomorrow. Richard sat beside me and said the line men say when they want to wound you and be forgiven in the same breath. I never meant for it to happen. I looked at him. Then you should have stopped after the first time. He had no answer. 2 weeks later, he moved into an apartment. 3 months after that, the divorce was final. I kept my maiden name, Elaine Porter. Seeing it on paper again felt strange, like finding an old coat in the back of a closet and realizing it still fit. The house was sold because neither of us could afford it alone without draining retirement money. That part hurt nearly as much as the divorce. I had planted the maple tree in the front yard when Melissa was 6. I had painted the kitchen yellow during the summer Richard lost his job, and we had to pretend we were happy because the children were watching. I had buried our old golden retriever under the lilac bushes. A house can hold a marriage even after the marriage stops holding itself. But I signed the papers. I packed my dishes. I donated half the furniture. Then I moved 90 miles away to a small town where no one knew me as Richard Caldwell's wife. Cedar Falls was not dramatic. It was not glamorous. It was quiet. And quiet was exactly what I needed. I rented a small 2-bedroom duplex near a walking trail. I bought curtains from a discount store. I took a part-time job at the public library shelving books 3 mornings a week. On Thursdays, I volunteered at the senior center helping widows and widowers fill out forms they were too proud to admit confused them. Little by little, I began building days that did not include waiting for Richard to come home. Some mornings were peaceful. Some were not. Grief has a way of arriving at ordinary times. In the cereal aisle, at a stoplight, while folding 1 towel instead of 2. But I was learning. I was learning how to eat dinner without listening for his truck. how to sleep diagonally across the bed, how to say I instead of we. Then in late October, Melissa called. She sounded careful, which meant she had news she didn't want to tell me. "Dad's getting married," she said. I sat down slowly. "When?" "Saturday." I closed my eyes. "Saturday. Not someday. Not eventually. Saturday. To Vanessa." "Yes." For a moment the room became very quiet. Then I surprised both of us by saying, "I hope they know what they're doing." Melissa exhaled. "Mom, you don't have to be gracious." "No," I said. "But I do have to live with myself." The wedding was held at a country club outside Des Moines. I did not attend. Of course I didn't. I spent that afternoon at the library helping a little girl find books about horses. After work, I bought soup from the grocery store and came home before dark. I told myself I was fine. Mostly I was. Then the calls began. At 7:42 p.m. "Richard." I ignored it. Then again. And again. By the time the phone rang for the 20th time, my hands had gone cold. Finally, another voicemail appeared. I pressed play. For several seconds, all I heard was breathing. Then Richard said, "Elaine, please." Judge Whitaker was at the wedding. He stood up during the toast and said something in front of everyone. A long pause. Then his voice cracked. I can't stop thinking about it. I stared at the phone. Judge Whitaker. Edward Whitaker. A retired county judge. One of Richard's oldest family friends. A man who had known us before we had children, before we had money, before Richard, became the kind of man who mistook comfort for love and attention for devotion. Richard swallowed hard on the recording. "He said something about you." Then the voicemail ended. I stood there for a long time. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, my phone began ringing again. The phone continued ringing for most of that evening. Not every minute. Just often enough to keep pulling my attention back toward a life I was trying to leave behind. I never answered. At 10 o'clock, I turned the phone off completely. Then I sat in my living room with a blanket over my lap and watched an old black and white movie I wasn't really paying attention to. Judge Whitaker. The name kept circling through my mind. Edward Whitaker had known Richard for nearly 40 years. He had known me almost as long. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed drama. He wasn't the kind of man who stood up at weddings to embarrass people, which meant whatever he had said had probably been important. The question was why? And more importantly, why was Richard acting like the world had shifted beneath his feet? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I missed my ex-husband. That part surprised me. 6 months earlier, I would have spent hours wondering what he was thinking. Now I mostly wondered why I cared. There is a difference. A painful one. But an important one. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen drinking a glass of water. The house was quiet. Peaceful. Mine. That thought still felt new. Mine. The word carried both loneliness and freedom. Sometimes at the same time, the next morning I turned my phone back on. 23 missed calls. 6 voicemails. 4 text messages, every single one from Richard. The final text simply read, "Please talk to me." I stared at it for a few seconds, then set the phone down. If someone ignores your feelings for 2 years, they don't get emergency access to yours just because they're suddenly uncomfortable. That may sound harsh. At 61, I call it perspective. A few hours later, Melissa called. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause. "You talked to Dad yet?" "No." Another pause. "He's kind of losing his mind." That caught my attention. Melissa wasn't dramatic. Never had been. "What happened?" I heard her exhale. Then, honestly, I don't know how to explain it. Try. For a moment, she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "The wedding started fine." "Okay." "Everything looked perfect." "Of course it did." "Perfect weddings are often designed to hide imperfect truths," Melissa continued. "Vanessa looked happy." I didn't respond. "Dad looked happy too." Again, I said nothing. The truth is, hearing that hurt a little. Not because I wanted him back. Because 34 years is a long time to be replaced. People don't talk enough about that part. Not jealousy. Replacement. The strange feeling of watching someone step into a life you helped build. Melissa must have sensed my silence. "Mom, I'm okay." "I know." Then she continued. "The ceremony was beautiful." Beautiful. Another word that can hide a lot of things. A beautiful room. A beautiful dress. A beautiful lie. The older I get, the less impressed I am by appearances. Then Melissa's voice changed. "The problem happened during the reception." I sat down at the kitchen table. "Go on." "There were speeches." That sounded harmless. "Friends, family, co-workers." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Then, And then Judge Whittaker stood up. There it was again. The judge. The man haunting Richard's voicemails. Melissa lowered her voice slightly. Nobody expected him to say much. What did he say? Mom. She stopped. I waited. Finally, she said, I don't think I can do it justice. That answer irritated me. Not because she was wrong. Because my curiosity was growing. Melissa. I'm serious. What did he say? Another pause. Then, he started by congratulating them. That sounded normal. He wished them happiness. Also normal. Then everything changed. I leaned forward. How? He started talking about marriage. I waited. And he started talking about commitment. Still waiting. Then he started talking about you. My stomach tightened. Not because I was afraid. Because I genuinely had no idea where this was going. Melissa sighed. I think he spent maybe 3 minutes talking. That's all. That's all. 3 minutes. Apparently, 3 minutes was enough to destroy an entire wedding reception. I found that strangely fascinating. Then what happened? Melissa laughed softly, a sad laugh. The room got really quiet. How quiet? Mom, you could hear silverware. I pictured it. Dozens of people sitting at round tables. Music stopping. Conversations dying. Everyone suddenly paying attention. A room full of witnesses. Then Dad stopped smiling. I said nothing. Then Vanessa stopped smiling. Again silence. Melissa hesitated. I don't think anyone knew what to do. That made sense. Most people know how to react to anger. Or tears. Or arguments. Truth is harder. Truth gives people nowhere to hide. What happened afterward? I asked. Dad drank too much. That surprised me. Richard wasn't a heavy drinker. Never had been. Then, he kept asking people what they thought. What did they think? Melissa laughed again, this time with genuine disbelief. The weird thing, what? Most of them agreed with the judge. I leaned back slowly. There it was. The part Richard couldn't handle. Not the speech. Not the wedding. Not the embarrassment. Consensus. For the first time he was hearing what other people had quietly believed for years. And apparently they all believed the same thing. A realization settled over me. Richard had spent months building a new life. But he had assumed everyone else viewed the past the way he did. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they never had. Maybe that was what terrified him. After we hung up, I spent most of the afternoon shelving books at the library. A retired teacher asked for recommendations. A little boy wanted dinosaur books. A widow named Claire brought me homemade banana bread. Life kept moving, which was probably why Richard's desperation felt so strange. My world had continued. His had suddenly stopped. That evening, another voicemail arrived. I listened. This time, his voice sounded exhausted. Elaine, please. A long pause. Then, I didn't know people saw things that way. I stared at the phone. Not people. People. Plural. The judge hadn't planted an idea. He had exposed one. And whatever he had said, Richard was finally beginning to understand that he might have been the last person in the room to see it. Nobody planned for Judge Whittaker to become the most talked-about person at the wedding. In fact, if you had asked anyone before the reception began, they probably would have described him as the safest speaker in the room. Edward Whittaker was 78 years old, a retired county judge, a widower, a grandfather, the kind of man who wore the same style of navy blazer for 20 years because he saw no reason to change something that worked. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't political. He wasn't known for making scenes, which was exactly why people listened when he stood up, and why Richard couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. 3 days after the wedding, I was shelving mystery novels at the library when my friend Claire walked in carrying her usual canvas tote bag. Claire was 66 and knew almost everyone in Cedar Falls. If a dog sneezed on Main Street, Claire would hear about it before sunset. She took one look at me and smiled. Your ex-husband's wedding has become local gossip. I groaned. Wonderful. Oh, stop. She laughed. You know, that's not the interesting part. I already knew where this was going. The judge. The judge. She leaned against the circulation desk. What exactly did he say? I shook my head. I still don't know. Claire stared at me. You mean Richard called you 20 times and never actually told you? That sounded ridiculous when she said it out loud. Yet it was true. Richard had called, texted, left voicemails, apologized, begged. But somehow he still hadn't repeated the actual speech, almost as if saying it aloud would make it more real. That realization stayed with me all afternoon. By the time I got home, curiosity had finally started winning. Not because I cared about the wedding, because I wanted to understand why a 3-minute speech had shaken a man more than losing his marriage. Around 6 o'clock, another voicemail appeared. I listened. This one was different. No pleading, no panic, just exhaustion. "Elaine," Richard said quietly, "I think you deserve to know what happened." For the first time, I didn't delete the message immediately. I sat down and listened all the way through. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Not physically older, emotionally older. As if something had finally caught up with him. Judge Whitaker stood up during the toast. A pause. He congratulated Vanessa and me. Another pause. Then he said something about marriage. I closed my eyes. Finally. We were getting somewhere. Richard continued. He said marriages don't survive because two people stay happy. I frowned slightly. That sounded like something Edward Whitaker would say. They survive because one person keeps showing up during seasons when happiness isn't available. The room around me seemed quieter. I listened carefully. Richard's breathing grew heavier. He talked about sacrifice. Another pause. He talked about loyalty. Then, he talked about you. I sat completely still. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn. Ordinary sounds, extraordinary moment. He said people celebrate success too much. Richard swallowed. And gratitude too little. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Or rather, neither version of us. The woman sitting in Iowa. The man recorded on a voicemail. Separated by 90 miles and 34 years of history. Then came the sentence. The sentence that apparently destroyed an entire reception. Richard's voice dropped. Judge Whitaker looked directly at me. A pause. Then, and he said, I found myself leaning forward. Success is easy to celebrate. Character is revealed by how you treat the person who stood beside you before you had any of it. Silence. The voicemail ended there. No explanation. No goodbye. Nothing. Just the sentence. I sat motionless for a long time. Not because the words were shocking. They weren't. Not really. The shocking part was that someone had finally said them out loud. Publicly. In a room full of people. To a man who had spent years believing nobody noticed. The truth is, marriages create witnesses. Not just spouses. Friends. Children. Neighbors. Co-workers. Family members. People watch. People remember. People form opinions. Most never say them. Apparently Judge Whitaker had. The next day, Melissa came to visit. She arrived carrying coffee and pumpkin muffins. A peace offering. Not that we were fighting. But children of divorce often become peacemakers even when nobody asks them to. We sat at my kitchen table. After a few minutes, I finally asked, "What happened after he said it?" Melissa immediately knew who I meant. "The judge." I nodded. She took a sip of coffee, then smiled slightly. "He wasn't finished." That surprised me. "There's more." "Oh yes." Apparently, after speaking about character, Judge Whitaker had started telling stories. Not dramatic stories. Ordinary ones. Which somehow made them worse. He mentioned the years when Richard's business struggled. The years when money was tight. The years when layoffs happened. The years when uncertainty filled every room. Then he started describing who carried the family through those years. Not Richard. Me. The birthday parties I planned. The second job I worked. The nights I stayed awake helping Melissa through asthma attacks while Richard traveled. The holidays. The caregiving. The endless invisible labor nobody notices until it's gone. He never criticized Dad, Melissa said. Not once. That sounded exactly right. A direct attack would have been easier. People defend themselves against attacks. Truth is harder. Melissa looked down at her coffee. You know what made it awkward? What? He wasn't telling people anything they didn't already know. There it was again. That same theme. Not revelation. Recognition. The room wasn't shocked because Judge Whitaker invented a story. The room was shocked because he said aloud what everyone had quietly observed for decades. How did Vanessa react? I asked. Melissa hesitated. Not well. I felt a brief flicker of sympathy. Then honesty replaced it. Vanessa had entered a relationship with a married man. Whatever discomfort she felt at that reception wasn't entirely undeserved. Did she leave? No. Did Dad? Melissa laughed. He wanted to. That answer surprised me. Why didn't he? Because leaving would have made it look worse. I nodded slowly. That sounded exactly like Richard. Concerned about appearances, even when appearances were already collapsing. That evening I took a walk along the Cedar River Trail. The air was cool. Leaves were beginning to change. Orange, gold, red. One of the quiet gifts of getting older is learning to appreciate things that don't require an audience. A sunset, a conversation, a peaceful walk. As I watched the river move beneath the bridge, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling angry. Not because Richard deserved forgiveness. Not yet. Because I suddenly realized something. Judge Whittaker hadn't spoken for me. He hadn't defended me. He hadn't rescued me. He had simply confirmed what I already knew. My life had value. My sacrifices mattered. Whether Richard appreciated them or not. Whether Vanessa understood them or not. Whether anyone applauded them or not. That realization felt surprisingly freeing. For the first time since the divorce, I wasn't wondering whether I had been enough. I knew I had. The only question left was whether Richard was finally beginning to understand it too, and judging by the calls that still hadn't stopped, the answer was probably yes. The calls didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent after I heard the actual speech. Not because Richard thought I would suddenly rush back into his arms. At least I hoped not. After 34 years of marriage, I knew my ex-husband well enough to recognize the difference between loneliness and regret. They often look alike from a distance, but they are not the same thing. Loneliness says, I miss having someone. Regret says, I miss the person. And I was beginning to suspect Richard had finally figured out which one mattered. 3 days after my walk along the river, another voicemail arrived. This one was shorter than the others. No explanations. No apologies. Just one sentence. Elaine, I think I spent years taking credit for things you were carrying. Then the message ended. I listened to it twice. Not because it moved me, because it surprised me. For most of our marriage, Richard had been many things. Hardworking, ambitious, reliable in certain ways, but self-awareness had never been his strongest quality. Now it seemed to be arriving all at once, and judging from the panic in his voice, he didn't know what to do with it. The following Saturday, Melissa came over again. This time she brought lunch. We sat on the back patio eating chicken salad sandwiches while autumn leaves drifted across the yard. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Her job, the grandchildren, holiday plans, normal life. Then eventually she said, Dad wants to see you. I took a sip of iced tea. I know. He asked me to ask. I smiled slightly. Of course he did. Melissa laughed. He thinks I'll convince you. Will you? No. That answer made me smile. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Mom, I love Dad. I know. I always will. I know that too. Then she looked down. But he really hurt you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Children never stop being children. Even when they're 40 years old. Some part of them always wishes their parents had managed to stay whole. I'll be okay, I said. Melissa nodded. Then she asked, Do you ever miss him? That question deserved an honest answer, so I gave one. Sometimes. She looked surprised. Really? Of course. I laughed softly. I was married to him for 34 years, not 34 days. People often assume healing means forgetting. It doesn't. Healing means remembering without falling apart. There were things I missed. Shared jokes, road trips, Sunday mornings. The version of Richard that existed before secrecy entered our home. But missing someone isn't the same as wanting them back. That distinction took me months to learn. 2 days later, Richard finally stopped leaving voicemails. Instead, he sent a letter. An actual handwritten letter. The sight of his handwriting immediately transported me backward through decades. Birthday cards, mortgage paperwork, Christmas gift tags. 34 years leaves traces everywhere. I almost threw the envelope away. Almost. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. The letter was 6 pages long. Very Richard. He always needed too many words once he finally started talking. The first few pages described the wedding, the reception, the awkward silence after Judge Whittaker's speech, the uncomfortable conversations afterward. Then came the part that mattered. For the first time, Richard described what had happened inside his own head. Not during the affair, not during the divorce. After the speech. According to him, the worst moment wasn't hearing the judge speak. The worst moment happened later. Guests began approaching him individually, not to criticize him, not to insult him, to agree with the judge, one after another. Old friends, co-workers, relatives, people he had known for years. Apparently several of them shared stories I didn't even remember, helping neighbors, taking care of elderly relatives, working extra shifts, supporting friends through crises. Small acts of kindness accumulated over decades. Richard wrote, "I realized people remembered things I barely noticed at the time." That sentence stayed with me, because it revealed something important. He hadn't forgotten my sacrifices. He had never fully seen them. And there is a difference. A painful difference, but an important one. Near the end of the letter, Richard wrote something else. Something that surprised me. "I don't think Judge Whitaker embarrassed me." I reread that line, then continued. "I think he introduced me to a version of myself I didn't want to meet." Now that sounded like regret. Real regret. Not regret for consequences. Regret for choices. The distinction mattered. A lot. Still, regret doesn't erase betrayal. And self-awareness doesn't automatically earn forgiveness. Those lessons take longer. 3 days later, I finally called him. Not because I wanted reconciliation. Because after months of silence, there was one conversation that needed to happen. The call lasted less than 10 minutes. Neither of us mentioned getting back together. Neither of us mentioned the affair. Not directly. Instead, we talked about something simpler. The letter. "I meant it," he said. "I know." Silence. Then, "I should have noticed." I stared out the window. The trees outside were almost bare now. Winter was approaching. "Yes," I said. Another silence. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "Would you meet me?" There it was. The request. The inevitable next step. Not a romantic dinner. Not a second chance. A conversation. A real one. Maybe the first real one we'd had in years. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to refuse. Part of me wanted to protect the peace I had built. But another part understood something. Closure isn't something people give you. Sometimes it's something you create yourself. "One meeting," I said. His exhale was almost audible. "Thank you." "One meeting," I repeated. "That's all." I understand. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, we had reached a place I never expected after the divorce. Not reconciliation. Not friendship. Not love. Something quieter. Honesty. And for two people who had spent years avoiding uncomfortable truths, honesty was going to be difficult. Because when we finally sat across from each other, there would be nowhere left to hide. The meeting took place on a gray Thursday afternoon in November. Not at a restaurant. Not at either of our homes. Neither of us wanted memories sitting at the table with us. Instead, we met at a small cafe halfway between Des Moines and Cedar Falls. The kind of place retirees like. Comfortable booths. Homemade pie. Waitresses who call everyone hun. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. For most of my marriage, arriving early meant arriving before Richard. Some things never change. I chose a booth near the window and ordered coffee. Outside, a cold wind pushed leaves across the parking lot. Inside, everything smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread. Then Richard walked in. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was strange. 6 months earlier, I had seen him almost every day. Now seeing him felt unfamiliar. Not because he looked different. Because I did. He seemed older. Tired. The confidence I had watched him wear for years appeared thinner somehow. Less certain. He spotted me and approached slowly. "Hi." "Hi." Not exactly a cinematic reunion. Just two people carrying decades of history into a quiet cafe. He sat down. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Richard smiled awkwardly. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't." "I wouldn't have blamed you." That was probably true. The waitress arrived and took his order. Coffee. Black. Some habits survive everything. When she left, silence returned. Finally, Richard leaned back. "I've rehearsed this conversation about 50 times. I smiled despite myself. "Only 50? That earned the first genuine laugh of the afternoon. A small one. But real." Then his expression softened. "Elaine, I owe you an apology." There it was. The sentence I'd expected. The sentence I'd waited years to hear. Strangely, hearing it didn't feel the way I imagined. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just sadness. Because apologies arrive after damage. Never before. "For what?" I asked. Richard stared at his coffee, then shook his head. "That's the problem." He looked up. "For too many things." I said nothing. He continued. "I thought the affair was the worst thing I did." A pause. "Now I'm not sure." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" His eyes moved toward the window. For several seconds he watched leaves blowing across the parking lot. Then he answered. "I think the worst thing was how normal it became." I frowned slightly. "The affair?" "No." His voice grew quieter. "Taking you for granted." The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were true. Very true. Richard wasn't describing one mistake. He was describing 20 years of small ones. The kind that accumulate. The kind people barely notice until they're standing alone. For the next hour, we talked more honestly than we had in years. Not about blame, about reality. Richard admitted something I never expected him to admit. He said the affair hadn't started because our marriage was terrible. It started because he enjoyed feeling admired. New. Interesting. Important. The explanation wasn't flattering, which made it believable. Most betrayals aren't caused by one giant problem. They're caused by dozens of smaller weaknesses left unchecked. I kept telling myself I deserved happiness, he said. And a bitter smile crossed his face. Turns out I already had it. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The waitress refilled our coffee. Life continued around us. A retired couple shared pie nearby. Someone laughed near the counter. The world wasn't ending. It had ended months ago. This was something else. Understanding. Eventually, I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind since the wedding. Why did Judge Whitaker affect you so much? Richard laughed softly. The laugh of a man who finally understood something embarrassing. Because I couldn't argue with him. I waited. He never attacked me. That's true. He never defended you. I nodded. Also true. Richard stared into his coffee. He just described reality. The answer surprised me. Not because it was profound. Because it was honest. A direct attack would have been easier. People defend themselves against attacks. Reality is harder. Reality simply sits there waiting. I spent weeks trying to prove he was wrong, Richard admitted. What happened? A sad smile. I couldn't. That was the moment I finally felt something unexpected. Compassion. Not enough to change the past. Not enough to restart anything. But enough to recognize genuine regret when I saw it. Then Richard asked the question I knew was coming. The question hidden beneath every other conversation. Can you forgive me? The cafe suddenly felt very quiet. Not because of the question. Because forgiveness is complicated. People treat it like a switch. You either forgive or you don't. Real life rarely works that way. I thought carefully before answering. Finally, I said, yes. His eyes widened slightly. Then I added, but that doesn't mean I want my marriage back. The relief disappeared. Not entirely, but enough. Because some part of him had still hoped. I could see it. The dangerous thing about regret is that it often arrives holding impossible expectations. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. I wasn't sure he did, but I appreciated the effort. I forgive you because I don't want to carry this forever, I said. Not because what happened was okay. He looked down. I know. And forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Another nod. I know that too. This time I believed him. When the conversation finally ended, nearly 2 hours had passed. We stood outside the cafe beneath a gray sky. The wind felt colder now. Winter was coming. Richard shoved his hands into his coat pockets, then smiled sadly. You seem happier. The observation caught me off guard, because 6 months earlier I would have argued. Denied it. Explained why I wasn't. Now I simply answered honestly. I am. A strange expression crossed his face. Not jealousy. Not resentment. Recognition. The realization that the woman he left behind had kept moving. Maybe even grown. Then he nodded. I'm glad. For once I believed him. We hugged. A brief hug. Not romantic. Not nostalgic. Just human. Then we walked toward our separate cars. Separate lives. Separate futures. As I drove home, I realized something important. The meeting hadn't given me closure. Closure had started months earlier. The day I stopped measuring my worth through someone else's appreciation. The meeting had simply confirmed it. And for the first time since the divorce, I felt completely free. What I didn't know was that one final chapter still remained. Not about Richard. Not about Vanessa. Not even about the wedding. About the life I had built after losing everything I thought I needed. Freedom is quieter than people imagine. When I was younger, I thought freedom would feel dramatic. A new beginning. A triumphant moment. Some grand declaration that everything had changed. Instead, freedom arrived in ordinary ways. It arrived the first morning I realized I hadn't thought about Richard before getting out of bed. It arrived when I bought a lamp without asking anyone else's opinion. It arrived when I spent an entire Saturday reading on the porch and didn't feel guilty for wasting time. Little things. The kind nobody notices except the person who lived without them. Winter settled over Iowa slowly. The trees emptied. The river darkened. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows. And for the first time in decades, I had complete control over how I spent the holidays. That sounded exciting in theory. In reality, it felt strange. For 34 years, Christmas had always been organized around Richard's family traditions. His mother's recipes, his preferred schedule, his expectations. Now there was only me, and I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted. That uncertainty felt surprisingly refreshing. At 61 years old, I was still learning who I was. A week before Thanksgiving, Claire invited me to help serve dinner at the community center. The event was designed for seniors who would otherwise spend the holiday alone. Widows, widowers, veterans, people whose children lived too far away, people who simply needed company. I almost declined. Then I remembered something. For most of my life, I had spent holidays taking care of everyone else. Maybe this was different. Maybe this was something I wanted. So I volunteered. That decision changed more than I expected. The dining hall buzzed with conversation. People shared stories, laughed, complained about politics, argued about football. In other words, they behaved exactly like family. At one point, I found myself sitting beside a retired school principal named Harold, 83 years old, sharp as a tack. He asked whether I was married. I hesitated, then said, "Recently divorced." He nodded thoughtfully. "Hard," I laughed. "That's one way to describe it." Harold smiled, then said something I carried home with me. Sometimes losing the wrong future makes room for the right one. At first, I dismissed it as another inspirational quote, the kind people put on calendars. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he might be right. For years, I had imagined one future, one version of old age, one version of retirement, one version of marriage. When that future disappeared, I assumed everything valuable disappeared with it. I was wrong. December brought another surprise. Vanessa called. Not Richard. Vanessa. I almost didn't answer. Almost. Curiosity won. "Hello." Several seconds passed. Then, Elaine. I immediately recognized her voice. "You don't forget the voice of the woman who helped end your marriage." What surprised me was how nervous she sounded. Yes. Another pause. Then, "I know this is strange." That was an understatement. "I suppose it is." She laughed softly, a strained laugh. The kind people use when they don't know how to begin. "I won't keep you long." I waited. Finally, she said, "I wanted to apologize. Of all the conversations I expected after my divorce, that one wasn't on the list." For several seconds, I said nothing. Not because I was angry. Because I genuinely didn't know what to say. Vanessa continued, "I don't expect forgiveness." "Okay. I just wanted you to know that I understand things differently now." That sentence interested me. Not because it excused anything. Because it suggested growth. "What changed?" I asked. Silence. Then honesty. "The wedding." I almost laughed. Apparently, Judge Whitaker's speech had affected more than one person. Vanessa sighed. "I spent years convincing myself your marriage was already over." I listened. No interruptions. No accusations. Just listening. Then I heard people talking about you. A pause. And I realized there were parts of the story I never wanted to see. That sounded painfully human. People often believe the version of reality that makes them comfortable, until reality becomes impossible to ignore. The conversation lasted only 15 minutes. When it ended, I felt lighter. Not because Vanessa had apologized, because resentment had finally started running out of places to hide. Christmas arrived quietly. Melissa hosted dinner. Richard attended. So did Vanessa. The old version of me would have dreaded that situation. The new version simply accepted it. Life moves forward, whether we're ready or not. The evening wasn't perfect. A little awkward. A little emotional. But surprisingly peaceful. At one point, I caught Richard watching me laugh with our grandchildren. Not longingly. Not sadly. Just thoughtfully. As if he were seeing something clearly for the first time. Maybe he was. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a text. A letter. From Richard. The second one. This one was shorter. Only 2 pages. I read it at my kitchen table while snow fell outside. Most of the letter discussed ordinary things. Family. Retirement. Life. Then near the end he wrote, "I spent years believing success meant getting everything I wanted." I paused. Then continued reading. "I understand now that success also means appreciating what you already have." I sat quietly for a long time after finishing. Not because the letter changed anything, because it confirmed something. People can change. Sometimes late, sometimes too late, but change is still possible. That realization mattered. Not for Richard, for me. Because carrying bitterness requires believing people never learn. And I no longer believed that. As winter slowly turned toward spring, I looked around my little house in Cedar Falls. The house wasn't fancy. The future wasn't perfect. But the life inside it belonged entirely to me. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. And maybe more than enough. Because somewhere along the way I had stopped seeing myself as the woman who got divorced. I had become something else. The woman who survived it. The woman who rebuilt. The woman who discovered that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. And that lesson was worth more than any apology. More than any wedding speech. More than any phone call. Spring arrived slowly in Iowa. The snow melted. The river swelled. The trees began turning green again. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, I found myself looking forward instead of backward. Not every day. Not every moment. Healing isn't that neat, but often enough to notice. That felt like progress. One Saturday morning, I was planting flowers in front of my duplex when Claire walked across the yard carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without asking, she handed me one. "You're smiling more?" I laughed. "That's your observation?" "It's a good observation." We sat on the porch steps. The morning sun felt warm against my face. For a few minutes, we simply watched people walking their dogs along the trail. Then Claire asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Richard hadn't called?" I considered the question. The truth was, I had thought about it. More than once. If he hadn't called, I said, I still would have been okay. Claire nodded. "I believe that." "So do I." And that was the most important realization of all. The wedding speech hadn't saved me. Richard's regret hadn't healed me. His apologies hadn't rebuilt my life. I had done that myself. One day at a time. One choice at a time. One painful step at a time. The speech had changed Richard. The rebuilding had changed me. Those were 2 very different journeys. A month later, Melissa invited the entire family to a barbecue. Nothing formal. Just family. Grandchildren running through the yard, hamburgers on the grill, paper plates, lawn chairs. The kind of gathering Americans have been hosting for generations. When I arrived, Ethan ran across the yard and wrapped his arms around me. "Grandma," I nearly dropped the pie I was carrying. He was 11 now. Growing too fast, as grandchildren always do. "Slow down," I laughed. "You'll knock me over." "No, I won't." The confidence of children. One of life's great pleasures. As I followed him toward the backyard, I noticed Richard standing near the grill, Vanessa beside him. For a moment, all 3 of us exchanged polite smiles. No tension. No resentment. No awkwardness. Not because the past had disappeared. Because we had stopped letting it control every room we entered. That is what forgiveness actually looks like. Not forgetting. Not excusing. Simply refusing to let old wounds make future decisions. Later that afternoon, Melissa pulled me aside. "I need to show you something." She handed me her phone. It was a photograph. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I realized it was a picture from the wedding. A candid photograph taken during Judge Whitaker's speech. The judge stood near the microphone. Richard sat frozen. Vanessa looked down at the table. The room around them was silent. I stared at the image for a long time. One photograph. One moment. One sentence. A sentence that had traveled farther than anyone expected. Melissa smiled. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "Everybody remembers the speech differently." I nodded. That made sense. People remember events through their own experiences. "What do you remember?" she asked. I thought carefully, then answered honestly. "I remember realizing I wasn't invisible." Melissa's eyes filled with tears. She hugged me. And in that moment, I understood something I wish more people learned earlier in life. Most of us spend years hoping someone else will finally recognize our sacrifices, our loyalty, our effort, our love. But peace arrives when we recognize those things ourselves. External validation feels wonderful. Self-respect lasts longer. Several weeks later, another letter arrived. The envelope immediately looked familiar. "Richard." Again. I smiled before opening it. Not because I was excited, because life had become unexpectedly predictable. The letter was only 1 page. Short. Simple. Honest. He wrote that he and Vanessa were settling into married life. That retirement was approaching. That he was trying to become a better listener. Then near the end he wrote, "Judge Whitaker passed away last week." I stopped reading. For a moment the room felt very still. I had known Edward Whitaker for decades. Not closely, but enough. He had been part of the landscape of our lives. One of those steady people you quietly assume will always be there. Until they aren't. I continued reading. Richard wrote, "At the funeral I kept thinking about something. Then, he gave me one of the most painful days of my life." A pause. Then the next sentence. "And one of the most important." I sat quietly after finishing. The old judge had never intended to create drama, never intended to destroy a wedding, never intended to punish anyone. He had simply spoken the truth. Kindly, directly, without cruelty, and somehow that had changed all of us. That evening I took my usual walk beside the river. The water moved steadily beneath the bridge. The sun dipped low across the horizon, and I found myself thinking about marriage, family, regret, second chances. Most people think revenge is about making someone suffer. I used to think that too. Now I know better. Real revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's discovering you can still stand after they leave. It's building a life so meaningful that bitterness no longer has room to live there. It's becoming whole enough that another person's regret no longer defines your future. Richard had his lessons. Vanessa had hers. I had mine. And perhaps that was enough. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly stood beside you during difficult years, perhaps today is a good day to tell them. Sometimes gratitude delayed becomes gratitude lost. And sometimes a simple thank you arrives just in time. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoy stories about family resilience, forgiveness, and second chances, I'd be honored if you shared this story or joined us again for another one. Until then, take care of the people who have quietly taken care of you.